Along with the Citroen DS, the P6 was probably the most ambitious car of the last century. Did you know that it was initially designed to run with a gas turbine engine? In this video, we're going to talk more about that, the story of the car, what it's like today to drive and own as a classic, and lastly, how much it would cost to buy in case this has whetted your appetite. In the 50s and 60s, there was a huge boom in construction of motorways across Europe. This in turn led to a big appetite for normal cars that could sustain high average speeds. And Rover spotted a gap in the market between the standard 1.5 litre family saloons and the more upper end luxury 3 litre cars like the Jag Mark II. Now it's worth keeping the BMW newer Classe in mind. That was released at around the same time and was practically identical in concept and size. Both had overhead camshafts, but the Rover produced 104 horsepower, whereas the BMW 1800 just 90. So in standard form at least, it outclassed the German. This one though is the hotter 2000 TC. It has an extra carb. It gives us 6 more horsepower for 110, and that compares nicely with the newer Classe 1800 Ti, which has Alpina tuning parts and exactly the same power. By the way, if you have a newer class, do get in touch because I'd love to do a review of one of those as well. After all the fuss that I made earlier, I'm sure you're dying to know just what it is about this car that makes it so advanced. Well, to start with, disc brakes all round was almost unknown on a car of this type in this segment in the 60s. Secondly, the bonnet and the rear boot lid are made of aluminium. And then there is that unique front suspension. Let's take a quick look. Now we're talking about the early 60s. At this point, family cars would have had a very basic suspension setup at the front. Some, up until the 50s, even still used sliding pillar. McPherson strut was considered advanced. But just have a look at this. So what we have here is you have an arm at the front, you have another locating arm at the rear. Then you have this, which is a bit like a McPherson strut, except that the damper, instead of being incorporated with the suspension with the spring, is actually located here on a pivot point that then pushes the spring and locates the spring at the back and the top of the car. Now the question is, why would they have done all this? And the reason is they wanted to get as much room as possible in the engine bay for that turbine. Now you can see here the panels that house those big springs, and it meant that you had extra room along the sides. Now, the fact that they wanted to fit a gas turbine engine to a family car just shows you the optimism, the can-do spirit that was around at the time, something that, by the way, is sorely lacking now. Now, in the end, they built a few prototypes, but wisely realised that a turbine wasn't the right propulsion unit for a family car. The extra room in the engine bay, though, did come in handy when they fitted the Buick-derived V8. At the back, it's no less radical because it has inboard disc brakes. That means you have less unsprung weight, but also a DD-on suspension setup. Now that is a great thing because it keeps the wheels parallel to the road. But normally you would have to have spline drive shafts. As they move up and down, the extension relative to the wheel is different. So the drive shaft has to be able to adjust for that. What they did to this instead is they had an adjustable DD-on tube with a little sliding shaft, something I've never seen before and I don't think since. There was though one downside of that fancy suspension system. Room in the boot is really quite limited. You can see here that the suspension encroaches in there. The spare wheel there, you could get a touring kit where they would put it on top of the boot, but that's really not very good for rear visibility. The Mafia definitely would not have been fans of this car. It was designed by David Bach, who spent most of his career at Rover and can be seen here with an SD1 in the background. Now, supposedly, he took the DS, the Citroen DS, as inspiration. I have to say, I found that hard to see myself, but in the flesh, the way the roof slopes a little bit, you can see it in that. And plus, if you look at the turbine prototype, which has a more sort of narrow squashed front end, then there are definite traces of the Citroen there. There was also a lot of fuss made about the interior. Now, the reason for that is that it was supposed to be a very safety conscious one. Now, I can't really see it myself, but apparently maybe some of these surfaces not being made of metal meant that it was slightly less dangerous than the previous cars would have been. It's really nicely made. It's got these seats are just fantastic, but also it has a very unusual thing, and that it has a glove box here, but also one just below the steering wheel there. But now, let's take it out for a drive. I'll tell you the rest of the story and what it's like to drive and own as a classic today. It feels a bit undignified in the old Rover, but it is number 27, so let's just take it through the gears. Four-speed gearbox, and it has a good turn of speed about it. 110 horsepower isn't amazing, but you can easily keep up with modern traffic with this, absolutely no problem. Now, even at slower speeds, it immediately becomes apparent to someone from a newer generation like me that this is unlike any Rover that I've been in before. There's an element of quality to it that, as much as I like them, was absent from the later offerings. The controls are really well weighed, so the steering at parking speeds is incredibly heavy, but as soon as you move up, it lightens up a fair bit, but still maintains a bit of reassuring heft. The gearbox similarly is pretty heavy. This has a shorter knob there for a bit of a sportier feel, but you can tell that it goes straight into the gearbox housing itself. There's no slop from any linkages on it. The clutch is beautifully light and progressive, and of course you're in these lovely padded seats that are more like armchairs, and the ride, it just feels expensive. I don't know how else to talk about it really. The ride is just beautiful. It's so calm. The whole car is calm, and at these speeds as well, I suspect in the corners we'll feel it a bit more, but at these speeds it controls body movement pretty well. There were no official estate versions of the P6, but there was an aftermarket one that was available through the dealers HR Owen. By all accounts, they weren't carried out very well. Those cars tend to suffer a lot from rust. Some of the panels were even riveted in. It was also very expensive at £800. A four-cylinder car started at £1,400. So most of the conversions were carried out on the V8 cars, and they were done 12 months after purchase, so they didn't have to pay the tax on that part of the conversion as well as the price of the new car. Rover did try and market these in North America. They had a few modifications to make them work in that market, so wraparound bumpers, more standard options. Bizarrely, it also had 3 scoops at the front. But unfortunately, they weren't very successful. And I think by 1971, they withdrew it from that market. In true British Leyland fashion, because they had quite a lot of leftover scoops, some of the British cars in later years also appeared with a single scoop on the bonnet. Now, the visibility and the view that you get from these older cars really is unmatched. And on the Rover, as well as all the old classic instrumentation, which is really endearing, you also have those tiny little teeth, whiskers, I don't know what you want to call them, the little scales from the side lights that are at the edges of the bonnet. Of course, that was to know that the side lights were on, but also when parking, they were really handy to show you exactly where the extremes of the bodywork were. I think it's a pretty attractive dash layout as well. You have some extra instrumentation there that wasn't there before, and these, I think the tachometer was an option at the time, but otherwise you have a wide sweeping section of wood which goes into the door panel on the side, which I think is really elegant. And the switchgear is so dainty. All the little toggle switches that you have on that row there, plus the indicator, which also doubles up if you pull it back as the little horn. It's just lovely, these old cars. So all in all, it's a very good start for the P6. And indeed, it was a huge success when launched. Unfortunately, as usual at this time in the UK, Labour relations stymied the full level of success that it could have achieved. In 1965, Rover's then managing director Martin Hurst was quoted as saying that they could have sold twice as many cars as they were able to produce, and that was because of all the strikes that were going on. Especially damaging were the unofficial ones. The brakes too are really surprising for a car of this era because, well, because they work. You have a really firm pedal on there and it actually stops. Having been in other cars that were built around this time, you have to appreciate just how revolutionary that would have been. Just another pull through the gears. It feels better than I thought it would do. It's quite a willing engine. I think on the tighter corners we're going to feel the downside, I suppose, of that very, very comfortable suspension. And okay, indeed, I mean, it is a little bit floppy, but you know what, it's not as bad as I thought, especially considering that there's no anti-roll bars at the front. Now clearly the P6 was a brilliant car, at least as good as a newer classic, and yet, although the latter signified the start of BMW's meteoric rise, this really in many ways was the end of Rover. It was the end of Rover because the cars that came after, as good as they were in many ways, it's hard to say that they were true Rovers in the same vein as these were. But also, whereas BMW became, you know, a huge company eventually, Rover sadly ended up dying off in the 2000s. It's quite a sad story. The good news though is that you can keep it alive by buying one of these. So if you wanted to, what would you be looking at? Well, I had a quick scout last night, and I think that project cars, cars needing work, start at around £4,000 to £5,000. The very best cars are between sort of 15 and 20, and you get some outliers where they're asking for 30, 35, even more on the continent. Now, generally speaking, the good news is that parts are readily available and they're not too expensive. The engines are quite reliable. I think if you're going to get the 4-cylinder engines like this one, then coolant leaks can be a bit of an issue. The V8s are very reliable, but you need to try and do oil changes every 3,000 miles, and coolant, because it is an all-alloy engine, is absolutely essential. You have to have the right kind of coolant and you have to flush it at least once a year. Apart from that though, they're very easy classics to own. They're not too expensive. On the evidence of what I've seen today and how lovely it is to drive, if you're not expecting a sports car, I would really encourage you to look at these. I think they are really vastly underrated. And when it comes to which model to go for, whether one of the 4-cylinder cars or the V8 has an undoubted appeal because of the way it develops the power, the extra power, that torque and the sound, but I wouldn't dismiss the 4-cylinder engines. This is a great little unit and it still works really well in this car. You might think that the 4-cylinder cars would also be a little bit more agile, but in fact that all-alloy V8 is practically the same weight. I think that those cars only weigh 20 kilos more, so in terms of handling, although I haven't tried one, I don't expect it to be vastly different between the two. This particular car has a lot of what most people would call patina on it. It really is very original. What I love about it is that Steve, who owns it, I mean, for him, he's not precious about it. He uses it all the time. So as a result, plus he's a mechanic, and as a result, it drives. I can tell, I can feel it drives absolutely spot on. But he's not too worried about a little bit of fading in the bodywork or anything like that. I mean, the upside of that is that you feel that you're in a real car. Obviously, there's a few little bits of wear here on the seat belts and so on, but it just adds to the story. Now, he is a mobile mechanic. I think he works in the sort of Northamptonshire, Oxfordshire area, but he'll go anywhere. So I'm going to put his details. He specialises on Triumphs and Rovers of this era. I'll put his details in the video description, as well as a link to his YouTube channel. He's done a few videos on this and some of the other cars that he's worked on as well. It remained in production until 1977. At that point, they built over 320,000 cars. So in some ways, it was a success. The problem was, especially towards the end of the production run, when it was fully under British Leyland, things seemed to have got quite a bit worse. So much so that in 1975, Drive magazine reported or gave the trophy to one of these as the worst car in England. Now that was only a year old, it had done 6,000 miles, and in that time it had gone through 3 engines, 2 gearboxes, 2 clutches and 1 wiring loom. It's such a shame because the potential of these cars, or the way they were designed and made originally, they were brilliant. Now today has been a real learning experience for me. I've got to truly appreciate what Rover used to signify as opposed to what it became, and it's such a shame that it all ended so badly. If you're interested in this era of car, do take a look at this video on the Humber Super Snipe. That is again a really interesting attempt by the Brits to try and burst out from their confines. Thank you so much to Steve for bringing it down, and most importantly to all of you for watching.